Hey, everyone, thanks for joining me. I'm here with Joe Rigney, and he's got this new book out on the sin of empathy. And if you've paid attention at all on social media, this drives liberal Christians nuts. The idea that empathy could be a sin blows their minds. I mean, they can't even conceptualize how that's true. And so, as a philosophy professor, I wanted to jump into this to see what is the moral theory operating behind liberal Christianity. And I think that it has to do with feelings, right? Empathy means you understand another person's position by trying to feel what they're feeling. And if they're feeling things that are sad, then that's bad. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think that this is part of the challenge is the contested definitions. The terms get kind of fluid, but I think for some people, empathy means something like walking a mile in someone's shoes or understanding where they're coming from, and it's a kind of mental act. So people call that cognitive empathy. Then there's a kind of affectional empathy where you act no, don't just know what they feel, but you actually feel what they feel. And I think in principle that could be good too. I think it's a normal human thing that we share emotions. When we see people who are sad, we feel sad,
Mm-hmm.
things like that.
Yeah.
The issue is then where does that take us? And I think the danger with empathy is it frequently takes us off our feet.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, feelings become God. Feelings are in the driver's seat. Feelings lead the way. And so other people's emotions are powerful. And in the same way that we can be blinded by anger or paralyzed by fear or overwhelmed by grief, that's the way we talk about these other emotions and passions. There's a similar kind of impairment and that happens when empathy or pity or compassion, whatever word you want to use, um, is really powerful, and it can sweep us off our feet. We can lose touch with what is true and what is good, and
Yeah.
we can follow people into gross wickedness. And I think liberal Christianity and the left in general has figured out a way to weaponize that dynamic
Mm-hmm.
and manipulate conservatives by their compassion because we want to be compassionate because Jesus told us to be. Jesus told us to weep with those who weep and to rejoice with those who rejoice and to be moved with compassion and so forth. So we know those are virtues that we need to have, but they've been redefined and particularized in a progressive way, such in the modern context, such that we are steered by our reputation as compassionate people.
Yeah, well, I think that's exactly right. And it almost ends up replacing the word. In other words, you have these feelings that are very strong and you want to do something about them, but you don't look to scripture to see what should we do in this case. And so I think one of the things you hinted at just now is that the problem is involved in what's called the is ought fallacy,
Mhm.
which is you're moving from an is, which is this other person is very sad, to a policy ought, like the government should give them money. And that doesn't follow. I mean, liberalism or cultural Marxism doesn't follow from the fact that someone's sad.
Right. Yeah, no, that's true. And I think, one of the over the last 20 years or so, this kind of logic of victimhood worked its way in subtly. No one ever said it quite as clearly, but when you press in, it was basically, I'm hurt, I'm sad, therefore you're wrong, you sinned. And because you're wrong and you sinned, you now need to make restitution because of what I did. But the issue is, it may be the case that because that someone's hurt and it was you caused it, you harmed them, you sinned against them. That's a possibility. But it's also possible that they're being overly sensitive or that they're using their pain, they're wielding their pain as a tool of emotional blackmail. C.S. Lewis is one of my heroes. I learned a lot from him on this subject. And he, in his book Great Divorce, talks about the way that pity. I talked sin of empathy. He talked about the passion of pity and
Yeah.
the way that it was used this way. And he said, pity was meant to be God's design for pity is that it's a spur to joy to help misery. So here's someone who's joyful, and pity is a spur to get that person to help someone who's hurting, and that's good.
Yeah.
That's moved with compassion like Christ. But it can he says it can be used the wrong way around. It can the miserable can hold joy hostage
Yeah.
as a kind of ransom, as a kind of blackmail, where they say, if you don't affirm me, validate, agree with me, do what I say, you don't love me.
Mhm.
And I'm sad about that. And so, and then Christians, soft-hearted Christians,
Yeah.
can be manipulated by it, and they're saying, "Oh, we'll do what you want in order to make it go away." And it's a universal phenomenon. This isn't like a I think anybody who's ever been on the receiving end of a pity party
Hmm.
or a guilt trip knows the dynamic I'm talking about. Or if you ever
Yeah.
put somebody on a pity party, if you've thrown a pity party in order to get your way with your spouse or your parents or somebody like
Yeah.
that, um, that dynamic is a universal human one. But in the last 20 or 30 years, it was institutionalized. It was made the kind of operating procedure for political movements, cultural movements,
Yeah.
to great effect.
Yeah.
The way that certain evils were able to advance in our culture was by the manipulation of people's pity and compassion.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I would suggest it goes back further. I mean, probably it goes back to the weaponization of pity to Marx and Engels and the Communist Manifesto, which is the attempt to merely look at material livelihood and say people who have less are good people and people who have more are bad people. And this has to be reversed through the dialectic. And my own work is on Princeton University. What happened at Princeton University? How do you go from Charles Hodge to rainbow safe spaces today? And one of the debates that happened in the 19 teens was about this kind of issue. The problem was, as Warfield was getting older, just about 2 years away from dying, the faculty under Professor Erdman said, we need to decrease biblical languages and increase practical theology classes so our ministers know how to minister into the poor parts of cities. Now, that's a fine Christian concern. But Warfield said, well, we don't want to do that, though, by taking away their knowledge of the biblical languages. So that was kind of the last conservative victory. He won that debate, but died a few years later. And then within that next decade, Machen and Van Til left Princeton because it went over to this idea that the main purpose of a minister is practical theology, helping people for their perceived needs.
Right. So obviously applying the Bible and practically applying the Bible is one of the things we teach at our seminary is the practical application of the Bible. But the issue is, as always, is it actually the Bible that you're applying, or have you adopted worldly
Yeah.
categories and you're applying them? So I think, in the last 100 years, it's no accident that in the same century, say from the 1920s to the 2020s, in which you have the rise of a kind of therapeutic um, ideology, a therapeutic mindset and way of approaching reality, therapeutic worldview, that empathy would become the pinnacle virtue.
Yeah.
The term didn't exist before then. It wasn't even a word. You can go look at Google. It doesn't exist. And then all of a sudden in the 50s and 60s, it get a little bit and then it just spikes. It's like a big hockey stick.
Yeah.
And you go, what is that? Why did we need a new term for responding to people in pain? And the reason is because a lot of people think that sympathy and compassion, the older terms for helping people, were insufficient.
Yeah.
Well, what made them insufficient? Well, because they didn't go far enough. They didn't dive in deep enough. They retained some connection to objective reality. They were willing to maintain boundary and make moral evaluations about what people were saying and doing.
Yeah.
And people found that intolerable. And they said, no, no, my feelings are sovereign. My feelings are in the driver's seat, and you have no right to withhold yourself from me. So ditch sympathy. It breeds, there's a famous video in which a prominent popular level author, Brene Brown, says sympathy breeds disconnection. It's aloof. It's indifferent. It doesn't get down in the pit with people.
Yeah.
So she talks about the sin of sympathy effectively.
Hmm.
And then she says, but empathy is this sacred space that stays out of judgment and that goes all the way in. And so it's that mentality that kind of rose in the West and then became a very powerful tool in the hands of the sensitive and their activists, their advocates, in order to further particular progressive agendas.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's where you go from that is so and so feels sad to the ought vote in this budget or something. And I
Right.
think you've isolated when you brought up C.S. Lewis and pity. That's the term I use in my logic class. The fallacy is called the appeal to pity, where you
Yeah.
say you need to do this for me or I'll feel sad.
Right.
And well, that's a fallacy.
Right.
I think there's something there where the victim status, the idea of woe is me, is very weak because what you're doing is you're saying, unless you do something for me, I'll keep feeling sad. And so it's a very childish approach to life rather than saying, I'm going to take control of my own life of feelings and I'm going to work towards feeling the way I want based on the things I have control of rather than putting in the hands of somebody else.
Yeah, well, and I think it's a particular it's a corruption of Christendom because of the Bible's emphasis on caring for the weak, caring for the poor, caring for the downtrodden, caring for the hurting. That's a real thing.
Mm-hmm.
Then this is one of the things I learned from Lewis is when any natural love, love of your family, love of friends, romantic love, when any natural love becomes a god, it
Mm-hmm.
becomes a demon. Right. So it's the greater, the better something is
Yeah.
in God's design, the more destructive it is when it goes wrong, when God's hand's not on the reins. And what I've done is basically, so Lewis wrote a whole book called The Four Loves in which he lays that out
Yeah.
and shows how, hey, natural love for your family is good, but here's how it can go wrong. It can become possessive and domineering and tyrannical. Love for your friends is good, but it can go wrong and become cliquish and arrogant and proud and so forth. And so he shows how these natural human loves, when they become untethered from divine love, go wrong. And what I've done is simply say, okay, what about the love for the weak, the hurting, and the broken?
Mm-hmm.
Is that susceptible to that same corruption? And
Yeah.
my argument is not only is it susceptible, but we've been living in a time in which that's the key way that certain people have gotten their way. Because victimhood conferred invulnerability. Victimhood, that's why we ended up with the victimhood Olympics that we've
Yeah.
all been a part of over the last 15, 20 years, where different groups competed to see who's been the most oppressed, the most marginalized, the greatest victim. And if you can get in that slot, you get your way. Society will
Yeah.
reorganize
That's right.
itself around your desires, your preferences, your demands. And
Mm-hmm.
that's so how did you get same-sex marriage? How do we get sodomite marriage? Well, because it's really sad that we don't have the same quote unquote rights as heterosexual couples. We can't get married, and therefore that makes us sad, and isn't that bad for us? And so you need to reorganize society, redefine marriage to suit our desires. Why, I feel sad because I feel like I'm in the wrong body, and therefore you need to give me puberty blockers, or you need to do castrations and do surgeries and so forth in order to make me feel better.
Yeah.
And one of the dangers of empathy in that regard is that it tends to be very short-sighted. It
Yeah.
focuses on the immediate distress of someone who's hurting as opposed to their long-term good. It loses sight of that
Right.
long-term good because I need to make the pain go away right now, and they think this will relieve it, and so I will do what they want, even though if you step back and go, well, wait, is castrating them going to help?
Yeah.
Right? Is the
Yeah.
abortion going to help? She's poor, she's gotten pregnant, and she thinks that having an abortion will make her feel better. Is that true? If it won't, then we shouldn't enable that or allow that, because A, there's an unborn child, and B, it's not going to help her. Her doing this evil thing to her child is not going to help her with whatever problem she has in her life. And so you have to actually have your pity and your compassion anchored and oriented by what God says is true, what
Right.
is good, by reality,
Right.
in order for it to be true compassion.
Well, that's right. And there's almost a sentiment of payback also. Like we've been suffering this long. Not only should you make it better for us, but we need extra stuff to be paid back for how you made us suffer. Now, there are legal precedents for that idea, but you got to prove it in a court of law. You can't just prove it in a court of emotions.
Right.
You need to have an actual person who goes to court and sues another actual person or entity, not just I feel sad and you made me feel sad for a long time. And I think what you got to right now is the key, which is love is focused on what is good for their person.
Right.
And our feelings and what is good for us, maybe they almost never line up. I don't know what the percentage would be, but feelings aren't a very good guide. I always laugh when I've seen soap operas, and I'm not saying I watch them a lot, but you'll see a character come to the grandma and say, I don't know what to do. And the grandma's advice is follow your heart.
Right.
But the girl got there by following her heart, right?
Yeah.
That's how she got into trouble in the first place. So Aristotle says if you don't know what is good, you can't actually love anybody.
Yeah.
What you're doing is usually a selfish thing, not love.
No, that's absolutely right. And so anchoring our loves, tethering our loves, properly defining it so that it's not hijacked. All of these are really important elements that we have to work through, and we have to do so in a highly contested environment where people mean different things by the terms they use, and some people really are just they have been wronged, and but that needs to be established. That needs to
Yeah.
be proven, and then once it is, now we take the right action. Now we can act appropriately. And in the meantime, I think this is important. So one of the things is, okay, if you have someone who comes to you and says, this horrible thing has happened to me, this so and so, I've been abused.
Mhm.
People hear me and they think that I would say, well, I don't believe you. It's like, no, no. All accusations need to be taken seriously, but that's different than the principle that was erected during the Me Too era of believe all women.
Mhm.
In other words, the ability to maintain an appropriate differentiated distance so that you can actually think rationally. Someone makes a serious accusation, call the cops. But
Yeah.
the reason you call the cops is because they need to investigate
Yeah.
and they need to prove and they need to establish things. And instead, what happened is that those kind of procedures and terms like abuse, for example, were inflated because of their potency as tools of steering.
Yeah.
So you had language inflation where abuse used to mean physical and sexual violence. If you were abused, you were a victim of physical and sexual violence. But then it was expanded to where now there's psychological abuse.
Yeah.
And I think the phenomenon exists, or emotional abuse, or spiritual abuse. And those were much more nebulous, much more difficult to define. But the word abuse was used to kind of mute any opposition, like it was weaponized, so that if somebody said this person emotionally abused me, and you said, well, do you mean you had marital conflict?
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
guys, you
No,
guys
that's the
fought?
thing. Yeah. We
You guys
disagreed. It
fought?
could just be that
Um,
they didn't agree with your opinion.
right. And so it's like, oh yeah, or any resistance to your demands is categorized as abuse. And people were ready to re-narrate their stories. And again, the point is not everybody's a liar. The issue is you have to have the capacity to determine what's true
Yeah.
before you just jump in with both feet in your emotional resonance. And so I want to take things seriously. I want to take them gravely, to take real action, and where appropriate, to weep with those who weep and
Yeah.
rejoice with those who rejoice. Share the emotions that can be shared, but it's not simply dive in and with wherever somebody wants to take me.
Yeah. And that's the cold, so to speak, cool-headed process of investigation is what people want to avoid because it kind of lowers the temperature of feelings. And so they want to keep the feelings amped up. And once you say, let's start to look at the evidence, they'll say, well, no, now you're not taking me seriously. But that's just the opposite. I'm taking you very seriously. And I want
Right.
to see, does this support your case? I think that it's good for Christians to know about our enemies. And mentioning Lewis, and he has screw tape letters. You get into some of the motives of the enemies. I wrote a series imitating Lewis for Clear Truth Media called The Red Tape Letters, where I'm looking at a Marxist mentoring a professor, because in my experience, liberal Marxist professors are very purposeful in undermining the faith of Christian students. And I find that the general liberal Christian is not aware of that. And so they don't think it's at that level. They think, well, Marx has some good points and we need to help the poor. Well, yeah, I mean, nobody says only false things. You're going to find some true things in Marx. It's almost impossible to say only untrue things. But he purposely wants to manipulate Christians to undermine our Christian belief by appealing to the pity about the poor. And I think that helps Christians to put on some of the armor of God to defend against those motives.
Yeah, and it's interesting, when it comes to like the Marxist thing, one of the things that Lewis observed, that I think surprises people because they think, how could you be, empathy is the antidote, it's the cure to all of our societal ills. We need more empathy. But empathy actually correlates pretty well with cruelty. And
Yeah.
the reason, and Lewis makes this point, he says, even a good emotion like pity, when it's detached from the moral law as a whole, leads through a very natural process through anger to cruelty.
Yeah.
Pity leads through anger to cruelty because
Yeah.
pity and he uses the Marxist category as an example. He says, pity for the oppressed classes leads very naturally to the unremitting brutalities of a reign of terror.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So it's like because I pity this group, it's myopic. It focuses in on certain suffering and therefore can rationalize and justify
Yeah.
great evil to other groups who we regard as the oppressors or enemies of this group. And it's like, and that's a human thing. That's a normal, it's like it's just as old as dirt,
Mhm.
tribalism. I love my tribe, and if you harm my tribe, I hurt you, I harm you back.
Yeah.
This is a real base. So empathy from my tribe means cruelty towards you.
Yep.
But what we've done is because we continue to dial up empathy and usually selective empathy, certain groups are designated as
Yeah.
worthy objects of empathy, and other groups are not. Other groups can't you can't feel it. So when Christians for a large number of times said we need to have empathy for the poor, what they meant was progressive, secular,
Yeah.
urban poor. But it's like, well, if I'm supposed to have compassion for the poor, does that include the coal miner and the red hat? Should I take his concerns on board? Should I try to calculate my rhetoric in order to appeal to him in the way that, and nobody, and very few people thought that way
Yeah.
because it was very selective and it had been coded in a progressive way that
Yep.
progressives had defined the key objects of compassion.
Yeah. Who gets to be? Yeah. I mean, in my experience, when I speak out, the group that I'm bullied by the most is LGBTQ people. So they would say, you ought to be sensitive and compassionate to us. But when I say something questioning their sexual philosophy, then I get very,
Right.
very vicious bullying. It's not just, hey, Anderson, let's have a debate about it. I'd like to debate
Right.
you in public. It's personal attacks.
You're evil, you're a hater. Yeah. You're bigot. Yeah.
So it is interesting. This whole moral theory says that the poor are always honest and good, and the rich are always liars and evil. So you believe the poor, and you think the rich are evil, and that fits into lots of these stories like the Me Too movement. And yet what I'll find is that the liberals want to help the poor get more money. If you really believe that being poor made you an honest, good person, wouldn't you want to stay poor?
Right. Well, what's interesting about the appeal to the Bible on this, because the Bible does have a lot to say about the poor, although usually the poor rich contrast in the scriptures is often actually like it's not simply about how much money's in your bank
Yeah.
account.
That's what I was going to bring up next. Yeah.
It,
The
it's how you,
spiritually poor.
it's how you got the money,
Yeah.
right? And did you steal from someone in order to get wealthy? But interestingly, when the Bible establishes principles of justice in this regard, Leviticus says you must not pervert justice.
Mhm.
You must not show partiality to the poor
Yeah.
or favoritism to the rich.
Could go
You're to
both
judge your
ways.
neighbor fairly. In other words, when it came to matters of justice, partiality in either direction. And we focus on, well, people are probably more likely to be partial to the rich because they want to get something from them.
Yeah.
But the Bible's aware that no, there's a different kind of partiality. You could be partial to the poor because, hordes of the poor can prop you up as a dictator,
Yeah.
right? Because they're going to they'll fight for you. And so partiality can work either way. Justice is a matter of what people are due and not simply a matter of how much money they have.
Yeah. And I think I pulled up a whole bunch of verses to go over with you about oppressor and oppressed, because there's no doubt the Bible says that to be concerned about the oppressed. But you're right to say this always has to do with sin, and the oppressed are oppressed under sin, not simply by not being rich. So the Bible never says hand them a bunch of money, redistribute wealth, and then the oppressed will be fine. In fact, Jesus rebukes the crowds for following him merely because they want more bread rather than not wanting the bread of life. So the idea that if I just had, when Jesus says to be poor in spirit and help the poor, if I just had more bread, that's what he's talking about. No, it's not. It's talking about knowing God. And so the difference between Dives and Lazarus is not, well, we need to take from that story to redistribute wealth, because it turns out Lazarus does pretty well for himself in the end, and Dives is in a bad spot. So the Marxist, I think, has convinced the Christians to reduce all poverty to material poverty and completely forget the category of spiritual poverty, which is our real problem.
That's exactly right. And so having biblical definitions for these things is really important, and knowing what your standard is. And so again, in a relativistic age, feelings will be sovereign
Mm-hmm.
because you don't have any other overarching standard. Now, usually it's feelings are sovereign, and then the standard will be erected and will be arbitrarily applied.
Mm-hmm.
So people are really good at rationalizing their feelings, having decided this is what we're going to do based on feelings. Now we have to come up with reasons,
Yeah.
and the reasons will shift depending on the circumstance.
Well, I think that's all. Yeah, that's right. And that also gets to the idea that I should never feel sad. And one of the questions I ask myself and others is, well, why not? well, I feel bad right now. Well, good. That's going to motivate you to do something different. I'm gonna work harder. I'm gonna start taking classes to get a different job. I'm gonna read books about how to repair my relationship. The idea that because you feel bad right now, it should be immediately changed by someone outside of you, rather than it being a motivation for you to improve yourself. It seems like it is almost the complete reverse, where it ends up harming you then. Whereas if you just ask yourself, why shouldn't I feel bad? I think you'll find out there's often not a good reason, besides that you don't know what you should know. You're not doing what you should be doing. And so feeling bad's okay. It motivates you.
That's right. Exactly right. Yeah. And because our motivations can be really complex, this is what the Bible says, your heart's deceitful above all things, who can trust it? You have to have some other standard than your heart, right? Your heart's the thing that needs to get put right in
Mm-hmm.
order to be able to act rightly in the world.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the verses I wanted to bring up was you'll hear a lot from liberal Christians about verses in the Old Testament about being kind to the sojourner or the foreigner in your midst because you were a foreigner once in Egypt. And they'll
Right.
isolate that verse out, and it is true 100%, but it goes with another fact that I've never heard anyone quote. The sojourner or the foreigner in Israel had to keep the law of Moses or suffer the consequences attached to the law of Moses.
Right.
You didn't get to move to Israel and just set up an Egyptian camp within Israel and say we're worshiping Ra over here. We're not doing what you say, but you got
Right.
to give us the same rights as every Israelite. That's not one of the scenarios in the Old Testament.
Right. Yeah. The way that verses about sojourners are corrupted to apply straight across to illegal immigration is a clear twisting of scripture. But it is a good illustration of the sin of empathy point. I had a friend send me a picture from the Mexico border, the Mexico side of the border wall, and on the wall at this one spot, written in big graffiti letters, was the word empathy.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a pretty good illustration of what I'm getting at, which is, look, according to the person who wrote that, why did they write empathy there? Because this wall, this boundary, this barrier was an affront to their empathy. Empathy means you're not allowed to have walls. Empathy means you're not allowed to have borders or boundaries. That's what empathy means. And that's true at the personal level. You have to just jump
I was
in
going
and
to say, yeah.
feel what I feel. So it's a metaphor, a really potent metaphor. But it was very clear that whatever they mean by empathy, it's not the biblical virtue because the Bible is not opposed to having a border. Israel had borders,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Well, that's why I think it almost obliterates every other context, because you could say in one sense that's true about the church. The church doesn't have borders, ethnically or racially or gender wise. The church is open to all nations, and all nations will be discipled, but nations themselves have borders. And so it's almost like a confusion of these two different categories. A nation's laws only extend to its borders. You can't enforce the tax code of the United States in Mexico. Everyone agrees to that,
Yeah,
but that also means you can't, you have borders about immigration as well.
right. Absolutely. Yeah, and this is a key we're like right now as we look in the culture and we see the Trump administration attempting to enforce our nation's laws, we'll see more sob stories. And at one level you can go, there is a tragedy here, but what people often
Yeah, that's
resist
it.
is the weaponization of that tragedy. So when you have, say, an illegal immigrant who has had a child in America, and therefore their child, according to the current understanding of the Constitution, is an American citizen. But we're going to deport the parents. What people will point out is they're making this child leave. They're making this they're deporting an American citizen with and say, well, no, what they're doing is saying we're deporting the parents. They're not here legally, therefore they need to go. And then we're giving them the choice. Do you want to take your child with you back to your country?
Yeah.
Because if you do, we'll make that happen as well. Or if you want to leave them with grandparents or somebody else who's here, that's fine.
Yeah.
But just simply the possibility, right? This sort of the attempt to appeal to people's compassion
Yeah.
for a child in a circumstances that they didn't choose, that's not their fault,
Right.
and to say, look at this horrible tragedy, and therefore, what's the conclusion? You're not allowed to deport people. You're not allowed to have a border.
Yeah. And that's
And,
what goes,
and
that
it's
is
and
odd problem.
exactly.
It would be very sad to have this happen. Therefore, what?
Therefore, what exactly? And so I think those are key ways, and I think increasingly Christians are aware of the way that they've been played on these matters, and I think a danger will be that they do then start to close their hearts off entirely. So there will be like the backlash and resistance to this could be bad. But that's why, when I've written on the subject, I want to both warn about the dangers and the sin of untethered empathy, and then I want to praise biblical
Yeah.
compassion that's actually soft-hearted, that's kind, that's tender-hearted, that's has bowels of mercy, but is also firm and can resist the manipulations.
Yeah, and I think it almost is biblical compassion is greater than anything the worldly empathy could ever think of. So when you actually experience compassion on the biblical level, you'll say, "Wow, this is greater. God's goodness is greater than what the world promised me through empathy." But I also one of the things I tell people is related to the child and the parents is zoom out. So if you were to start off story and were to tell me, "Hey, there's this guy and he has to sit in an 8 by 8 room all day," I would say, "Well, that's terrible. I would hate to sit in an 8 by 8 room. I'd be really depressed."
Right.
And not only that, he gets really just low level sustenance food. He doesn't get any good yummy stuff. Well, that's really bad. Well, zoom out a little bit. So he murdered 10 people.
Right.
Okay, then well, that changes my feelings a little bit.
Right.
So zoom out from the initial story, which you can agree, yeah, that would be terrible to sit in a room like that all day, to the actual circumstances. And then they'll say something like, well, but it's because he was bullied in high school. Well, again, you got to zoom out more, like, okay, what was going on? And so
Yep.
I always find out that when you start zooming out, what's at the heart of this is the problem of evil. And it reveals that Christians just don't have a good solution. I'm speaking generally, not about us theologians or philosophers, but Christians in general don't understand why there's suffering in the world and what to do about it. And where's God when these things happen? And so our initial response in terms of this empathy is just to say, I want suffering to cease. I want it to be over, rather than what is God doing here? Why are we under, for example, why are we under the judgment of God? And what are we supposed to do about it?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Well, and one of the key, stories on that regard that really illustrates this point in the Bible is the story of Job.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because, and I'm thinking particularly about his relationship with his wife. I use this example in the book. Here's a woman who's lost, through no fault of her own. 10 children have died. She's, has this great estate. Her husband has this great estate, and all of their stuff's been stolen by raiders. And their kids are dead, and now her husband is covered in sores and sitting there worship in sackcloth and ashes, worshiping God. And she comes to him and she says, "Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die."
Mm-hmm.
And as a pastor, I go like, "Well, yeah,
A lot of
she's a,
hurt.
there's a lot of pain here, and she's sad, and in her grief, she's saying angry things at God. She's speaking out of her anger at this situation and directing it at God. And at that moment, it would be very easy for a husband who's also grieving to join her in her form of sorrow and to say, "You're right, honey. God has wronged us. God is evil," and to curse God because of these actions, these things that have happened. And Job instead doesn't do that.
Mm-hmm.
And it really is, you have to think about how difficult, just put yourself in the situation, right? Have a little imagination, put yourself in the
Yeah.
situation and realize, what would you do if your wife was saying that? Job says, "You're speaking foolishly.
Mm-hmm.
You speak like a foolish woman. You don't know what you're talking about. Shall we receive good from the Lord and not evil?
Yeah.
Lord gives, Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Like, God is God. And so there's a deep trust that Job has. He's anchored to the goodness of God. Now he has questions. He's going to ask some of those questions, but he's going to ask them, at least initially, from a humility before God and a trust in his wisdom and goodness. Whereas his wife has said, "No, there's no way that God can still be good if this evil has happened to me. I hate him."
Yeah.
And so but that's a good illustration of
Yeah, it
the
is.
need to have some anchoring in God's character in order to face something like the problem of evil.
Yeah, 100%. That's that one of my favorite books as a philosopher in the Bible, because I think Job is the first philosopher. And so the whole book is a dialogue long before the Platonic dialogue showed up about this most important question: why is there suffering? But maybe that's also a good illustration of how much suffering we have to go through in order to see ourselves honestly, because Job then has to go through chapter upon chapter of this debate until he gets to a point where he's told, "You justified yourself, Job, rather than justified me, God."
Right.
So that's another point that I'm not sure Christians in our lives of ease right now understand. God's providential rule in your life. God's bringing about something for you that's good. and you can put yourself in his hands and trust him. But the fact that it takes so much suffering for Job, who's the most righteous, well, the rest of us better take some fear of God from that, right? Because what's it going to take for me then?
Right. That's exactly right. So having like and these are the sort of issues that people really need to wrestle through before the suffering happens,
Yeah, yep.
right? There's a way even like as a pastor thinking about trying to help people in the suffering. When the moment's intense, it's really difficult to do what Job did and to offer the correction. And frequently the correction can be motivated by our own discomfort that someone is as sad as they are.
Yeah,
And
you're
so
right.
it's far more important to like establish deep biblical roots in the sovereign goodness of God before you ever face the unthinkable.
Yep.
Because once that foundation is laid, then because you have that foundation, you can grieve the way that biblical figures grieved. You can
Yep.
weep the way David wept. You can weep the way Christ wept. You can
Oh,
grieve the way Job wept. So you can feel deeply and you can join other people in that sorrow because there's that shared foundation of
mhm.
God's goodness and kindness in the greatest horrors. Um, you know,
Yep.
most clearly demonstrated in the cross.
That's right. You got to get that foundation in place first. I think the Proverbs say that a wise man sees trouble coming and plans ahead. And that's really something we do in the area of life, right? That's the point of like self-defense classes. You don't wait until you're mugged in the moment to try to figure out how to defend yourself, saving up for a rainy day. So I think all those things are true. Now, a last point is I also wonder what it says about our suffering. We've been talking about 120 plus years since Marxism, but let's just take 15, 20 years, the kinds of suffering we go through. We've just been thinking about D-Day, the celebration of the anniversary of D-Day. My wife's grandfather landed at Normandy that day on D-Day. He lived through it and he became a Christian not long after that because of the things he experienced and his realization of the truth of the Bible. But the things that we suffer today don't really compare to that. I mean, I don't know anybody who's being called to just get in this boat and when the door opens, you run as fast as you can towards the machine guns. The kinds of things people complain about are things you mentioned earlier, like you disagree with me about my sexual philosophy. And so I'm gonna have a meltdown because I can't handle being disagreed about. Can you imagine the difference between those? Like talking to someone one day who was in D-Day and saying, well, I know
Right.
what you went through, buddy. I had a hard time too. Someone disagreed with me at work.
Right. No, absolutely. Yeah, which is why, the invention of the microaggression should have been answered with the micro caring.
Yeah, that's right. I like
And
that.
micro care because it was, and again, it's another example of that language inflation, that concept creep, where aggression had to be because it wasn't actual aggression, it wasn't actual oppression. It had to be expanded, and at least in that case, uh, they tried to acknowledge the fact that these are really small things.
Yeah.
But what was remarkable is during that, at least that window of time when that was a real big deal, how many people were like, well, we really need to watch out we need to make sure we don't commit any microaggressions. And we're willing to adapt to the sensitivities of others. But what you discover when you do that, when you accommodate um, the sensitivities of others out of empathy, you get more of what you're subsidizing.
Yeah.
You get more of it. You increase the sensitivity.
Encourage
You
it.
you, you don't you don't decrease you don't increase responsibility. You don't say, yeah, things are hard and trust God and take responsibility for yourself. If you were really wronged, pursue justice. All of that's fine, but the sinking into your feelings is a major problem in the West.
Well, and I think that reveals a whole epistemology behind this system, which is that earlier when we were talking and I mentioned Princeton, I saw a little smirk in your face. It went away quickly, but that tells me something about your heart. I'm just making this up, right? Something in there, you hate Princeton theology or something. And so it's almost like microaggressions were supposed to be a window into what the person's really thinking. And then you can judge them based on that, even though they never said that and never acted on it. You have this whole indictment about them because their mouth turned up a little bit when you said something.
Right.
And so it's just a terrible epistemology. It wouldn't hold up in any legal court, but it is all about I feel really sad inside. And I do wonder if Jocko's just got the right answer. Jocko would just say, good,
Right. Yeah.
good.
Well, there is
It's
a
just
there
going to
is
make
a
you better.
or JD Vance's I don't really care, Margaret.
Yeah.
Like, like just in other words, keeping your eye on the ball and bringing it back down to brass tacks to reality, and saying, reality is reality and your feelings need to conform to reality, not the other way around.
Yeah. Well, that used to be when you read psychologists like Rollo May from the 50s and even early cognitive behavioral guys from the early 80s, the whole idea of therapy was to integrate your mind into reality.
Right.
Now it's the reverse.
Right.
Reality has to be integrated into you. So, in other words, if you came to a psychologist, a cognitive behavioral psychologist in 1980, you said, "Hey, I think I'm Napoleon," he would say, "Okay, we got some work to do because your mind is not integrated in reality." Now they would say, "Well, let's get you that height surgery. You're a little too tall, and I know where we can get a French general's outfit, and we'll get you. We'll make reality conform to your belief that you're Napoleon." So it's like a whole reversal of what therapy really is, if you have it at all, integrating yourself into what's real, knowing reality.
Right. That's exactly right. Yeah, there has been this, and that's that rise of that therapeutic culture, which inverted. This is C.S. Lewis in The Abolition of Man, where the old form of education was trying to get train young people to conform their souls to the way the world is, to the Tao, to the God's laws that's inscribed in nature and then echoed in Scripture. Whereas the newer form is about subduing reality to the wishes of men. And of course, the trans movement is kind of I don't know if it's the end game of that, but it's getting close
Yeah.
where we're at war with biology based on feelings.
Yeah.
And then it's a good example of the feelings are in the driver's seat, so we're going to do the castrations and so forth, but also the way that empathy can be manipulated. Would you rather have a dead son or a live daughter?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is an appeal to parental compassion,
Yeah.
right? That
The
you
worst
know is
thing a parent
there.
can think of. That's terrifying.
Exactly. Exactly. And it's a catechetical thing. They're, kids who get sucked down the rabbit hole of the gender cult are trained, are catechized. This is what you say if they resist. This is what the doctors are trained to say to
Yeah.
parents who are going, I don't think we should do the puberty blockers. Maybe it's just a phase. No, no. Would you rather have a dead son or a
Yeah.
live
Yeah.
daughter in order to what? In order to overcome any resistance based on reality.
Yeah, that's right. And so a lot of big issues here. I think we've touched on some from very good ones. And really, your book and this whole discussion reminds all of us Christians the Bible's our standard, not how we feel, not our own opinions. We come back to the Bible as our standard. The Bible does show true compassion and true empathy. It teaches us how to do that, but it also protects us from the abuses that unbelievers like Marx purposely have been using to undermine the church. So thank you very much for your work.
Yeah. Thanks, Owen. Appreciate it.